Hello, I'm Caroline Bicks. I'm a professor of English at the University of Maine in Orono, Maine, in the United States of America. And today I am going to talk to you about girls' brains in Shakespeare's world. So today I want to take you inside the brains of Shakespeare's adolescent girls and to talk to you about my recent book, Cognition and Girlhood in Shakespeare's World, Rethinking Female Adolescence. Inside girls' brains, it's generally a place that scholars avoid. When they do talk about teenage girls in Shakespeare's time, they prefer to focus on their sexually maturing bodies and all of the problems that those allegedly caused. When scholars do touch on or talk about the workings of the adolescent female brain, they tend to pathologize it. They focus on girls being overwhelmed by their emotions or mentally disabled, either by love sickness or the hysterical diseases that supposedly were brought on by puberty, sometimes to the point of madness or self-destruction. Let's take, for example, Juliet Capulet. She's arguably the most famous teenager in Shakespeare's world. She's a girl we tend to remember as one who falls in love at first sight, then quickly loses herself to her Romeo, and then to her suicidal death. Her age, which is mentioned many times in the play as being almost 14, is typically understood as a marker of her sexual maturity by people who study the play. But if we consider Juliet's age and her behavior only in terms of her sexuality and her hyper aroused emotional state, what are we not seeing about her? What do we risk missing, especially when it comes to what she was doing with her mind? These are the questions that really led me to write my book. It seemed to me that we were vastly oversimplifying all of the complex desires and meanings that people in Shakespeare's day were attaching to this figure of the 14-year-old girl and to the drama of her movement from being a child to being an adolescent. What I found was that female puberty, which was usually imagined to happen at age 14, was initiating girls into this extended stage in their development that was characterized by really dynamic and productive cognitive activity. Now, in Shakespeare's day, brains were not separate from bodies. That's not how they were thought about. What happened inside the head was always affected by the body in which that brain was embedded, and also by the environments through which the body-mind moved. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Ultimately, what I argue is that the changing adolescent female brain and all of that dynamic cognition was reflecting a lot of the turbulent changes of the 16th and 17th centuries. It was a kind of a lightning rod, as it was imagined, for some of the period's most vital debates about the body and the soul and faith and salvation and nature and science and the universe, and the place and agency of human perception in the midst of it all. Now, teenage girls clearly inspired early modern playwrights who frequently feature 14, 15-year-old girls, especially, engaging in what I call brain work. And it's really unusual because most playwrights do not name the ages or mark the ages of their characters, but they do it precisely and frequently when it comes to these teenage girls. We know exactly how old Juliet is. We know exactly how old Perdita is, or Marina, or even Viola. So the girls that I analyze in my book, they really harness the powers of their mental faculties in ways that early moderns depicted, I argue, as really unique and expansively engaged with the world around them. They use their imaginations to see beyond restrictive social codes and to envision all kinds of futures for themselves. With the cognitive faculty of understanding, they judge the people and ideas around them. They manipulate existing forms to invent new arts and sciences, which I'll talk a little bit about. And also their memories, the cognitive faculty of memory. They're able to store up their country's histories, not just their personal histories. They bear witness to all kinds of communal traumas. Their brains are imagined to take in, absorb, assess, judge, and remember what other brains can't or won't. And yet, these artful and perceptive female brains just don't seem to fit our modern day popular view of what's happening inside girls' heads. The one that's distracted and emotionally driven and irrational and even suicidal. These are the ways in which girls like Juliet and Ophelia in particular have come down to us in the Western European tradition. So they've given us everything from Taylor Swift videos, this one, Taylor Swift's love story, Romeo Save Me, this popular Taylor Swift lyric, other popular modern day notions. They've given us things like Ophelia.com, which is online treatment for opioid dependence. So why do we use these Shakespearean girls to market or promote particular versions of female adolescence that are connected to illness, sickness, helplessness, vulnerability? When Mary Cowden Clarke wrote her Girlhood of Shakespeare's Heroines in 1851, which was a group of fan fiction backstories she invented for a lot of Shakespeare's girl characters, she created a really sensitive Juliet, one who's completely devoid of any kind of rational thought. And that makes sense because when Mary Cowden Clarke is writing, she's embodying a real Victorian idea about girlhood and innocence. So this is the description she gives of Juliet, the white dove of Verona. That's the name of the story in which Juliet appears. She writes, her heart informed her mind, profoundly impressionable, her sense and instinct were more at work than any mental processes. Her soul was elevated by its native purity and affinity with beauty rather than by any inspiration or effort of intellect. Right. It's really interesting. And as Clarke was writing and imagining this childlike, innocent, unthinking Juliet, John Everett Millay was creating what would become the iconographic image of Ophelia as an adolescent girl drowning in her self-destructive grief. Many people know this image of Ophelia without even having read the play Hamlet. When I teach this play, this is an image that my students know about. But what's so interesting is that this is never portrayed on stage, of course. This isn't part of what we see of Ophelia. It's what's described of her after her death by Gertrude. Psychologist Mary Pifer's 1994 best-selling book, Reviving Ophelia, Saving the Selves of Adolescent Girls, it really helped cement this relationship between erratic and endangered adolescent girlhood and Shakespeare's tragic heroine for a popular American audience. Work like hers testifies to the endurance and the marketability of this Ophelia, the one who's remembered for her uncontrolled and self-destructive tendencies, but not for her frequent acts of perception and artistry and really ironclad memory in the play. These are specific kinds of brain work that I explore in my book. Where is the beauteous majesty of Denmark, she asks, when she first enters the play as her allegedly mad self. According to a stage direction in the first quarto of Hamlet, Ophelia asks this question directly to the court while playing on a lute. That's the stage direction. Enter Ophelia playing on a lute. But rarely is that the stage direction that we're going to get now in modern editions, because it wasn't in the Quarto 2 or the Folio. And rarely do you see it in performances. So why? What do we lose? This controlled performance is just not included. But if everyone in the rotting state of Denmark seems to have forgotten why her question about the lost majesty of Denmark matters, is it really so surprising that modern day readers and audiences also miss its importance, as well as the brain work of the girl who's asking it? One of the paths that led me to my current project, it started with work I'd done for my first work, my first book on midwives, where I was looking at a lot of 16th and 17th century anatomical texts about sexuality and birth and the body. And in these works, what we find is a female brain that for the most part looks pretty inferior to the male brain. This idea, it was based in ancient Greek theories of the humeral body. So in this belief system, we all have four humors. We have blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and each one of these is keyed to the four elements, earth, water, air, fire, and also to the four qualities of dry, hot, moist, and cold. But everyone's born with a different balance of these humors, and this affects their personality, their temperament. But what's interesting is that balance changes every day, depending on things like what's the climate today? Is it hot? Is it the steaming hot summer in Verona as it is in Romeo and Juliet? What did you have for breakfast? Did you get a good night's sleep? But the balance of these humors was also based on things like gender and age. Now, the typical adult woman's body was believed to be colder and wetter, while a man's body was perceived to be hotter and drier in this system. Not always, but that was sort of the typical way things were believed to exist. And this was also, the reason this matters is because this was also believed, whatever the balance was happening of these humors in your body, that was believed to impact how you thought, what was happening inside your brain. Because in Shakespeare's day, brains are embodied. They're actually connected to what's happening to your body. They weren't thought of as separate. Unlike men, women weren't able, it was believed, to produce enough heat in their bodies to keep all of these humors efficiently in motion and moderated. And that's why it was believed that, for example, women needed to menstruate to get rid of all of the excess blood and other kinds of humoral matter that men's bodies were efficiently able to just keep burning up. And this lack of heat meant that their brains were also seen as deficient. Their bodies couldn't really ignite what was believed to be this heat refining process in the brain that produced animal spirits. And those animal spirits would be responsible for moving ideas and images through all the different parts of the brain. The front part, where imagination for the most part was believed to reside, the middle part, which was essentially where rational judgment happened, and then the back part of the brain where memory was meant to be. When early modern critics talk about the female brain, they really tend to rely on this familiar narrative about its inferiority. But girls who are on the verge or in the midst of sexual maturation look really endangered. If we take this approach, then yes, they look like they're going to be endangered. So turning to medical accounts, for example, historian Helen King, she talks about the minds of adolescent girls as being really disabled by their maturing bodies at this time. They don't ripen, instead they become putrefied because they hold on to their menstrual fluid and their seeds. And this makes them prone to something that was called green sickness. So Helen King, a wonderful scholar, a historian of science, she talks about how there was this sort of rediscovery of the illness of green sickness during the 16th century, and talks about why that is that people in Shakespeare's day thought girls were mentally disabled, which again, I'm going to push back against and show you in a little bit here. But this was an alleged disease, right? And it could cause vapors to ascend into the brain, and then girls would lose their rational faculties. That was one way that was described. And you certainly can find fictional depictions of girls at this time in Shakespeare's day, like, for example, the jailer's daughter from Shakespeare and Fletcher's Two Noble Kinsmen. She's a teenager who seems to be, the only way you could be cured of this green sickness was to have sex, because this would release the fluids that girls were holding on to. And ideally, of course, you wanted it to be marital sex. That was the hope. And this would cure all of your mental problems. And there's a character in Shakespeare and Fletcher's Two Noble Kinsmen who apparently has fallen prey to this green sickness and illness and has become hysterical. And the only way she's cured is by being tricked into having sex with someone who's not the man she thinks it is. So That's a particularly insidious example of what the jailer's daughter will call the pushes that wenches are driven to when 15 once has found us, she says. And even Shakespeare's own son-in-law, John Hall, diagnosed Shakespeare's 15-year-old granddaughter with a uterine pathology that was believed to strike adolescent girls in particular. His granddaughter, Elizabeth, had been suffering from convulsions of the mouth and was cured, according to Hall's doctor's notes, after he administered pills and unguents to his daughter that brought on her menstruation. Now, these are captivating stories, to be sure, but they aren't the only ones that people were telling during Shakespeare's day. And they really didn't match what, for the most part, I was seeing when I looked at what most teenage girls were doing with their brains as they were being depicted at the time. Not just in Shakespeare's plays, but in all kinds of early modern stories and images and discourses. That's what really drove me to research and write this book as well. Because by focusing in on a sustained and really deep way about girls' cognition, I'm looking to push back against this long tradition that is presuming early moderns only viewed girls' brains and bodies as prone to illness and distraction, and that they were only inferior. On the contrary, what my research really shows is that unlike those older, colder adult woman versions of themselves, girls' bodies appeared to really burst with heat when they experienced the changes that culminated in their first menses or menarche. And this transformation was depicted as activating girls' principal mental faculties in new and really largely positive ways. Now, I want to go back to some of my slides here. One slide that I missed here that's important. This is an image of what the brain looked like to early modern people. And what's interesting about it, so this is where all the senses would come in, to your tongue, your eyes, your ears, your smells, and then they would enter this front part of the brain. And I know it's kind of hard to read the language here, but it's imagination and fantasy is at the front of the brain there. And it's not as if this was not disputed. There were people who believed that, for example, the imagination was also in the middle of the brain, but this is sort of a pretty typical way of how people would have been thinking about how the brain was organized. In the middle is where you get cogitation, estimation, that's sort of the rational understanding. And then in the back, you have memory. So again, those animal spirits would be seen to move these ideas and images through the brain, also down to the heart at certain points, back up to the brain. But just to give you a sense of how they were thinking the layout of the brain looked, I think it's just important to have that. So now I want to talk to you about how medical writers from Shakespeare's time were actually describing puberty in their texts. There aren't a ton of descriptions, but when they show up, they're really interesting. For the most part, they're taken from ancient Aristotelian depictions, but they make their own tweaks to them that I think are particular to the time period and to the country. So this is from Helkiah Crook's enormously popular huge medical book, Microcosmographia, which he translated from a lot of classical and Arabic sources, explicitly because he really thought it was important that surgeons and other lay people be able to read about the body in a language they could understand. If you're a surgeon, if you're a midwife, if you're an average person, you're not being trained in Latin and Greek as these physicians would have been. So he made it a project to really translate this into English and put it out there for people to know. So that's really interesting too, just for the history of science and thinking about this as a moment when the average person could have access to descriptions of the body that they otherwise would not have had. So this is how he describes what happens at age 14 to girls' bodies. He says, the heat begins to gather strength, to burst forth as the sun in his brightness and to rule in the horizon of the body, from which heat proceeds large enough the ways, vessels, and the strength of the expelling faculty. So why is this interesting? It's really interesting to me because it's completely non-pathological. There's nothing here that indicates that the girl's body's getting out of control or she's losing her mind. It's really quite ordered. And after he describes this moment of the first menstruation, the strength of the expelling faculty because of the heat. This is for me the really interesting passage. He says, at age 14, men begin to grow hairy, to have lustful imaginations, and to change their voice. Women's paps or breasts begin to swell, and they to think upon husbands. So this is interesting for a number of reasons. So imagination, right, which we saw was generally believed to be in the sort of the front of the brain, it was considered the most impressionable one, the most fragile of the mental faculties. It's sort of the first one to go when the brain's compromised by any negative internal or environmental factors. But here, Crook, he's singling out the young male imagination at age 14, not the females, for its vulnerability. The young men he describes, they don't have this newly stimulated imagination under their control. It's kind of thrust upon them. They don't really seem to have control over it. Now, Crook's negative depiction of male adolescent cognition, it had a lot of support from other early modern writers. This is one of my favorite quotes. This is from a 1576 text by Lemnius, the touchstone of complexions. And he's describing what happens to 14 and 15-year-old boys when they reach puberty. They're incited to immoderate pleasures they're not incited to them through reason. So there's no reason or any well-stayed discretion, but by impotency of mind and willful affection, digressing and swerving from modesty, temperance, and moderation, the lack whereof googleth their unstayed heads. And I absolutely love that phrase, because the idea of like these Google-headed, not Google as we know it now, but Google-headed young 14 and 15-year-old boys, to me, it's so evocative. It's such a wonderful image. It's so everyday. Like you can imagine exactly what an unstayed, Googled-headed young boy would be. And this was by no means the only depiction like this. They're all over the place. But now let's go back and think about Crook's relatively positive depiction then of the changing female at puberty and what's happening inside her mind. Because his depiction of a thinking 14-year-old girl whose body is just burst with heat, first of all, it's suggesting that she's being thermally transformed, and she's going to be able to concoct in her brain what her older, colder female self wouldn't be able to, right? Those brisk animal spirits that really powered all the mental faculties and would move ideas and images through the brain. But it also seems to have incited and activated more than just her imagination, because when you think about it, to think upon something, to think upon husbands in this case, it requires evaluation, cogitation, really things that are more rational and intellectual. And it also means she has to be able to project herself into multiple possible futures, to think upon husbands, plural. So it's not like I'm only thinking about one man. She's thinking about futures, and that requires the cognitive skill of prospection, being able to project yourself into all kinds of possible futures. And once you start looking at the girls as they're depicted, not just in Shakespeare's plays, but all over the place, you see them going through this quite methodical process of thinking about their futures. And again, that's a development of a particular cognitive ability that we do not see in the depictions of these young males. Now, depending on one's social class, of course, the time between thinking of a husband or husbands and having one, it could be a matter of a year, or it could be more than a decade, or it might never happen at all, as some studies are showing. Could be that up to 20% of females never wed at all in the 17th century in England. There's a great quote from one writer at this time that the vehemency of adolescence could last between the age of 14 and 28. So think about that. That's a long span of time. And this time of what I call prolonged adolescence was really seen as this space of creative and often productive cognitive activity for girls. It's a lot of time for them to be doing things with their brains. And they were focusing their brain work on far more than just husbands in what I'm taking a look at, if they're even thinking of husbands at all. But marriage does seem to mark an end to this stage of enhanced female cognition. And that's why in my book, I really limit what I'm defined as a girl as anyone who's crossed over into puberty and who is married. So that could be a big span of time or a short one. And the reason I did that, there's a great, once she married, a girl allegedly, right, was supposed to turn her mind toward her husband and her household. This is a quote from a piece of fiction by Robert Greene called Mammalia, where it's described that marriage is such a restraint of liberty as it feeleth not the spark of freedom. For both the body is given as a slave unto the will of an other man, and the mind is subject to sorrow and bound in the cave of care. I find this a really rich image for thinking about what marriage was perceived to mean for a female. Because of course her body would be given in certain ways, and that could have violent consequences. Not always, of course, but it could. But what would it mean for a mind to be bound? What does that look like? At the end of The Taming of the Shrew, for example, the tamed wife, Kate, she's talking to all of the outspoken newlywed women at the end of Taming of the Shrew, and she tells them, "My mind hath been as big as one of yours." And in identifying her shrunken mind, I think Kate is really graphically showing the effects of marriage on the female mind. Because earlier in the play, if you know The Taming of the Shrew, she'll say whatever's on her mind. In fact, one of the first things she says to her very new husband, Petruchio, is, "I am no child, no babe. Your betters have endured me, say my mind, and if you cannot, you better stop your ears." But when she gives that final speech to those newlywed women, she's already been beaten down to size by Petruchio. He's already physically and mentally, emotionally abused her. She's been bound in the sorrowful cave of care. In my chapter on the imagination, I talk about Desdemona from Othello, because I think she really serves as a kind of case study in how a girl's mind becomes bound in that cave of care. Because I track how her imaginative abilities, which are so strong and enlivened at the beginning of that play, they really have to start to telescope over the course of the play, because she has to restrict her discourse of thought, as it's called, to really accommodate Othello's jealous fantasies. Right? She really has to pay attention to what he wants her to be thinking to save her life, which she isn't able to. So this is a cognitive shift that I talk about is really, it's fatal to them both. Nobody wins with this kind of telescoping of her imaginative faculties. So my argument really has two interlocking premises. One is that in post-Reformation England, which is a time when all girls now, were expected to marry and turn their minds toward husbands, because you can't be a nun anymore, although I'll talk a little bit about nuns in just a second. So if that was the goal, is that all girls ultimately are supposed to turn their minds to husbands and to marriage in post-Reformation England under Protestantism, one of the things I'm thinking about is how early moderns were imagining that stretch of time then before they were married as one of relative cognitive freedom, liberty, and flexibility. And that these temporarily free, flexible adolescent minds really were materially expressed through all of this new, agile, industrious brain work. And that they were really kind of seen as boundless just for this section of time. So in my first chapter, for example, I take a close look at the brain work of Juliet, Capulet from Romeo and Juliet, because she's really engaging in all kinds of interesting mental activities as she's experiencing this change of 14 years. So contrary to what we may remember about her based on more modern depictions, love does not make her helpless or out of control. She's actually one of the most controlled adolescent girls you'll find, and not because she's repressed. She doesn't need to be saved by Romeo. She never uses any of that language. And she's also not suffering from the mentally and physically disabling disease of green sickness, even though her father thinks she is. Remember, green sickness is a disease that's reserved for girls who are virgins at this time. And when Juliet's father says, "Oh, you're a green sickness carrion," we know, although no one else knows, that she's, except Romeo and the nurse, that she's already been married and had marital intercourse. So that's one of those great examples of like, well, maybe the parents think that your daughter's green sick and going crazy, but we, the audience, have access to another story that she tells us. That's not what's happening to her. And in contrast, and she's able to go through these extraordinary acts of bravery and focus. When she goes to the friar, when she finds out she's going to have to marry Paris, and the friar is like, well, I can see you have the strength of will to handle what I'm about to put on you. Do you want to take this death potion and fake your death? And she's like, yes, I will do it. Like, so she's able to imagine terrifying things that will happen when she wakes up in the crypt and still go forward in quite a methodical way. Now, in contrast, Romeo's much more like those overwhelmed adolescent boys that we saw described, right? At the start of the play, he's completely disabled by his love for Rosaline, not for Juliet. His friend Mercutio is going to cry, Romeo, humors, madman, passion, lover, right? And he really does embody that melancholic, unstable male brain that we saw in the medical texts. And although love sickness could afflict females as well, certainly, in Shakespeare's plays, it's almost always the young men who are typically more prone to this and to the condition's disabling mental effects. You think about like the lunatic lovers, Demetrius and Lysander in Midsummer Night's Dream, or the moody Orlando in As You Like It. But beyond the plays, I just want to finish up with a couple examples of some other kinds of girls I look at in my book, because plays are wonderful. And of course, we should take a look at them, especially as lovers of Shakespeare. But I really wanted to make my argument that this wasn't just happening on the stage, right? Because what Shakespeare's doing is he's participating in debates and ideas that were happening off the stage as well, of course. He as well also had teenage daughters at home. So, and as we saw, a granddaughter. So there's a really interesting example. I'm going to get back to my slides now and share one of my favorite finds from my study. In Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, he takes, he had many editions of it, but in his 1624 edition of Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, he takes an ancient story from Pliny that was originally about the invention of the plastic arts by the potter Buenos. That's how that story is told. And he changes it into one that features the potter's daughter, actually, as the creator of a whole new art form. In the story, Buenos' daughter, she traces the shadow of her soon-to-be absent lover on a wall with coal. And according to Burton, he says this was the first picture that was ever made. So a story that was originally about how a male potter invented the plastic arts with the help of his daughter. I mean, she's still in that story originally. Now it's really about this girl being the inventor of the first picture that was ever made. And this version of the myth captured the imagination of European artists for centuries. This is a particularly beautiful one by Jean-Baptiste Wignaud. And you can see her creating, it's called The Origins of Art. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. So think about that. And just to finish up, one type of adolescent female that I find really interesting from this time period, from Shakespeare's time, is that those post-Reformation English Catholic girls, right, who were very much still alive, who were training to commit themselves to God. Obviously, they couldn't do that on English soil, but that didn't mean they still weren't known to English people during Shakespeare's day, or living in recusant households in England. So even though they weren't officially allowed to train on English soil in this time period when Shakespeare's writing his plays, they're still living and training on the continent. And one of the things that I've started thinking about is, in the absence of these praying females who are committed to God and to the salvation of their Christian communities through prayer and explicitly through remembrance, that's a word that comes up a lot. Where could early modern English subjects turn then for these spiritual services? Is this part of why we see depictions of these female brains in plays and elsewhere as being these important repositories for communal memory and for salvation, among other things? I'm really convinced there's more than just hostile innuendo to Hamlet's demand of Ophelia that she remember all of his sins in his prayers and get to a nunnery. I think there's something else going on there. And in my final chapter, I take a look at the autobiographical fragments of a real woman, the Catholic pioneer Mary Ward, who founded an unenclosed institute for English girls and women on the continent, based on the Jesuit model of active apostolic missionary work. So women weren't allowed to be Jesuits, but she had a vision. She had a sense that came to her when she was 15, that she should start a community of women based on the Jesuits' principles of going out into the world and converting and saving English Catholics. So it's really interesting reading her autobiographical fragments and how she describes specifically what was happening inside her brain when she was 14 and 15, and this is happening. And after her death, her English followers commissioned a set of oil paintings depicting these key moments in her spiritual development that she writes about in her autobiographical fragments, including an episode that she often describes of herself when she's 15, when she fixes her mind on martyrdom, as she describes it. It's really interesting. This is one of my favorite paintings from that collection. So you can see her looking really intently, fixing her mind, not just on martyrdom, but on these stories, right? She's taking in stories about martyrs. She describes that she's reading stories of the martyrs and she's imagining herself being a martyr. So this is projecting herself into a future that has nothing to do with husbands. So despite so much evidence to the contrary, we still seem to prefer our early modern girls unhinged and vulnerable and naive. And as a result, we have these profound blind spots when it comes to recognizing all of that cognitive dynamism. But also, and more importantly, I want to end this with this, we don't really fully then understand early modern girlhood. And this then impacts how we understand female adolescence in our own time, because we're often using those Shakespearean characters as touch points or how they've been adapted. Girlhood scholar Catherine Driscoll speaks to this point when she argues that our modern ideas about female adolescence are really informed by earlier depictions of Shakespeare's girls, and that these notions then shape how we look back on the past and how we see the originals. One of my goals with Cognition and Girlhood, there it is, is to put pressure on those familiar but ultimately skewed readings of the past. The interpretive lens that I develop, I hope allows for a necessary revision of early modern girls, even those whom we'd left for crazy. In Hamlet, Horatio describes how the allegedly mad Ophelia's winks and nods and gestures indeed would make one think there might be thought. As my work shows, Ophelia is just one of many early modern girls who were thinking, who were using their brain work to judge and revise and leave their mark on the world and the people around them, to imagine and invent new ways of thinking, to pursue their desires, and if possible, to change and expand their lives and not end them. Thank you.
The first topic I would like to bring in your consideration is, have you worked on Melancholy at that time? Because it was like a big movement, right?
Huge movement. And I'm really glad you brought that up. So yes, so Melancholy, and there's been really wonderful work done on this. I highly recommend Liesl Dawson's work on this, for example. Because melancholy is typically understood as a masculine disease. It's one that, like Hamlet is melancholic, and it launches you into greater intellectual thought. But what Liesl Dawson's showing is that, in fact, melancholia could also be female, and it could also mean that it would enliven certain intellectual activities. But yeah, so Robert Burton's, where that great description of Debuty's daughter inventing painting comes from The Anatomy of Melancholy, right? In a whole section on lovesickness, or the melancholia that's caused by lovesickness. So it's really interesting for thinking about a way of thinking about illness as something that can inspire art and invention, and not just disability. So I do look at it from that point of view in the book. But it was primarily thought of as this male disease. Romeo's called melancholic. Pericles is melancholic. It tends to be that the great male characters suffer from melancholia, is one way to describe them. But I think, again, what we miss when we think about that as the only kind of mental disability for males during this time is we miss those wonderful descriptions of the teenage boys. And of course, so many of Shakespeare's male characters are teenagers, I mean, we don't think of them that way because they're not named in the same way that the girl characters are, or not identified as teenagers, but I think we can certainly identify them as adolescents. They haven't reached the full adult stage where they can take control of a household.
When we're talking about early modern and the Elizabethan period, you describe in a very detailed way how society tend to look girls, teenage girls, right? And I was wondering, since you have a book at your back that says Elizabeth the First,
Oh, yeah.
there it is. If there's any relationship, because if society was waiting for the girls to think in husbands, right? And yeah, thinking in husbands, and what was the other? Yeah, mainly thinking in husbands and
Thinking upon
getting married, right? It's
and
like,
getting married. Well, yeah,
what
that's
happened with the queen at the
what happened to
time?
the queen. So that's another great layer to this, is that, of course, when Shakespeare's writing the bulk of so many of these great plays we love to talk about, there's a queen there's an unmarried queen who fashions herself as perpetually virgin. And there are plenty of interesting things to think about too, about Elizabeth's own adolescence. I mean, she wrote during her own adolescence, and she's fascinating, but she's an example, I think, of that kind of woman who represents, and I'm intrigued by this. If you're perpetually never married, does that mean you're perpetually in this incited cognitive time? Does that mean that if you never have to bind your mind to a husband, do you get to be free forever? Now, of course, I'm oversimplifying this, because you can be unmarried and be profoundly not free in many other ways. We have to think about this intersectionally. Someone who's a servant in someone's house is going to be endangered if she's not married in certain ways. So I don't want to make it seem like, yay, everyone's free if you're not married. And certainly Elizabeth had her share of mental, things she had to worry about. But I do think, just conceptually thinking about this space of girlhood as one in which early moderns were imagining there was a flexibility to what was happening inside their brains. So that even though Crook is saying they're thinking upon husbands, again, I'm really intrigued by husbands. It's and then when you start to look, like, there's a great scene in Romeo and Juliet. It's Juliet's first scene, and her mother is saying, you should think about marriage. It's time to think about marriage. And she uses that word. And Juliet says, well, it's depending on which version of Romeo and Juliet, it's either it's an hour I'm not thinking about, or it's an honor I'm not thinking about. So I'm going to have to go back to see which has hour and which has honor. But she's saying, I'm not thinking actually about that, which doesn't mean she's not thinking about anything else. It just means she's not thinking about marriage at that particular moment. So that to me is why would Shakespeare highlight that as the first thing she's saying? It's like, it's an honor she says, I'm not dreaming of it, actually. So that's another interesting thing. I have a whole section about girls' dreams in the book too, and what they were imagined to be able to do with their dreams.
So there's a double sense in there. I mean, Juliet says that, and one could think, well, she's not a teenager yet. And on the other hand, you can say, well, yes, she is a teenager, but she's not. She's just don't think about being married. It's like,
exactly. But I think that the way she tends to be thought about by scholars is like, well, because once she's 2 weeks shy of her 14th birthday, once she meets Romeo, she blossoms and becomes that. It's like, well, I think she was already there before she met him. If we're thinking about what she's thinking and dreaming about, she was already activated and interested. So you don't have to literally just turn 14. And whether or not she's had her first period, I mean, that's what's so interesting to me too, like why her father is like, she has not yet seen the change of 14 years. That's what he says to Paris in the scene before that. She's not yet, before I can think her ripe to be a bride, let's let 2 more summers go by. So that's a father trying to put his version of her development onto her. In the next scene, Juliet's mother is going to be like, I was a mother by the time I was your age. You should be a mother now too. So it's a really interesting way, I think, that Shakespeare's using that figure of the girl on the verge as this really dynamic figure that everyone wants something out of. Everyone wants her to become something. But ultimately, what's amazing about Juliet to me is like she just creates everything in that play. She makes her future. It's a sad one, but she makes it. When she decides to take that potion, she's like, all right, I'm going to wake up maybe and see, see all these bones and go cuckoo, but I'm doing it anyway. And she doesn't go crazy.
Yeah, well, I wrote down for women, Juliet, Ophelia, of course, Desdemona, and also Portia, right? From
Oh, and the Merchant of Venice.
Yeah, there's Jessica there as well. But and if you want to include them, all these five girls, they're having really a hard time with their fathers, because the five of them, their fathers are trying to, you know,
Control them.
yeah, exactly. Even from
Even
the
in death.
afterlife. Yeah, exactly.
Even in
So
death.
Juliet, well, we talked about Juliet, but I was wondering about, for instance, I mean, Juliet, Portia, even, well, Jessica, maybe Desdemona as well. She got killed. They try to move forward, right? And Ophelia seems to, well, she's suicide, right? She was not strong enough. So where do you place Ophelia in that?
Well,
In
the
this
first thing
group?
I would say is that we don't know how Ophelia, whether it was a suicide or not. And the characters in the play say that too. They say it's debatable, it was doubtful, and we don't see it. So that's the first thing I would say is like, why do we assume it's suicide? And part of it, I think, is because, again, we look back to the past with a view of what we think female adolescence was about, that it must have been unhinged and unstable. My argument about Ophelia is that I actually think we can think of her as a performer, because Hamlet puts on an antic disposition. The players are putting on all kinds of things. She comes on stage. If she's playing on a lute, as she was in the first quarto, she's a performer as well. There's a way to think of, and what is she talking about? She's talking about Danish history. And she actually has quite a power over her audience as they're looking at her. Now, there are a lot of complications with this argument, but I really think it's important that we not just put her in a box as she couldn't handle it, she killed herself, because there are a lot more complexities to her. But one thing I think is interesting to think about too is that because the girls that you're talking about, those are mostly tragedies. When you go to the comedies, something different is happening, which I think is really, that opens up more spaces for options for these girls, because Desdemona, and it's not to take away from what I think really is powerful brain work that Desdemona is doing in the play. And to me, this really is a play about the tragedy of not just what happens to girls' minds, obviously, because it's a play about race as well. But if you look at, for example, Helena from All's Well That Ends Well, she's a great example of, in a comedy, a girl who's an orphan. She's free from her father's expectations. In fact, her father has given her all of his medical recipes so that she can cure the king and get the guy that she's been wanting all along. So I find her a fascinating, if you look at all the cognitive language about, she talks about storing her father's recipe for that fistula in her brain like a triple eye. It's amazing. So I put her next to someone like Debuty's daughter, who invents that new art form, right? Who's using their father's arts to create a new one. So that's sort of one example like that. Someone like Viola is another really interesting example from Twelfth Night, who, even though she has a twin brother who would be exactly the same age as her, we only get Viola identified by her age. She's probably moving through the play in her 14th year, because her father died. She and Sebastian's daughter died when they were 13. So she as well has a flexibility in what she's able to do with her brain. Not to say, again, that there aren't limitations, because both All's Well That Ends Well and Twelfth Night, these girls are limited in what they're able to do ultimately. So I think Shakespeare understood that. Again, it's not like, whoo, go off, conquer the world, go become president or whatever. But if you look at how they're interacting and affecting their communities and their belief systems, they're able to do really important work. So even if Ophelia, only some people understand what she's saying, some people do. Some people get it. Gertrude gets it. She's like, ooh, I get what she's talking about. She's reminding us about Hamlet Senior.
Did you explore Miranda in your book?
Yes, so I have a whole chapter on Miranda. So Miranda is also in the chapter with Helena from All's Well That Ends Well and Debuterty's daughter, because what really got me interested in her, because she's obviously also really explicitly, her age is, she's 14. She's in her 15th year, because Prospero tells us this. He says, we came here just before you were 3, and we've been here for 12 years. And what I got really interested in with Miranda is that, because again, she's typically read as father-daughter pairs are typically in the scholarship, and I don't know how other people feel about it, but for the most part, fathers and daughters get read as the daughter is subservient to the father's trying to control her, and she really doesn't have much of a mind of her own, or if she does, it's only in relation to wanting to get married to someone else. So again, she's typically read in terms of the drama of the sexually maturing girl and the father's desire to control her or to not let her go. But when I went back and I looked at that opening scene between her and Prospero, she's doing some incredible things with her brain. She's assessing what he's doing. There's this tempest that he's set loose. She's judging him for that. She's assessing it. She's feeling the pain of what she's seeing, those mariners that she believes have been drowned. And she describes it's beating in her mind is what she described. That's the phrase that really caught my attention. It's beating in my mind. I thought, what does that mean? So I started looking at that phrase, beating minds. They really are almost always only in Shakespeare associated with female brains. Things beat in girls' minds, which is fascinating to me. And not like out of control. It's like a beating upon something. Which is such a material thing too, because in Shakespeare's day, they thought of brain work as very material. Like you actually could fix your mind on something or beat on something or have it stamped. So I was thinking about her as an important figure of looking to the future of new science and new ways of thinking, as opposed to her father's old magic, his old dusty magic. That's how my argument about her.
Yeah, we're talking about Miranda, and I wrote down also, well, Desdemona, Ophelia, Portia, Miranda, Lavinia,
Lavinia,
Cordelia.
Cordelia.
They don't have a mother figure.
They don't.
It's absent, absolutely. It's just their dads, right? When we find a strong mother, it's always with a son. It's like Tamora or Gertrude or Volumnia, right? Those are strong mothers with sons.
Yes.
And do you think that this might have something to do with the staging of this adolescence, right? It's like, well, it's like mothers, they don't have nothing really important to say, right? It's like it's just.
I would push back on that to say we have to turn to his later plays and look at something like The Winter's Tale or Pericles, where you have mothers. I mean, granted, yes, they disappear for much of their daughters growing up, but they return. And to me, The Winter's Tale is actually the most important play for talking about the importance of mothers, and not just mothers in a saintly way, but really embodied motherhood, because Hermione at the beginning of The Winter's Tale, not only is she pregnant with her daughter, she has a 7-year-old son. And she has a profoundly embodied relationship with both of them. And she's very authorized because of her maternity. And nobody believes Leontes. Leontes is a tyrant. He's ridiculous. So I think her return at the end, and of course it's connected to the myth of Persephone and Ceres or Demeter, which is all about the power of mothers' relationships to their daughters. So I think Shakespeare understood that. And so when Perdita returns at the end of Perdita and Hermione are reunited at the end of The Winter's Tale, and it's been 16 years, And Perdita's kneeling to her mother, and Hermione wakes up, or whatever it is, and doesn't say a word to her husband. She turns to her daughter. She says, tell me, mine own, how have you preserved yourself? Because I have preserved myself to see the issue, meaning you. So I think there's actually incredibly powerful mother-daughter relationships in Shakespeare. They just aren't always front and center. And you're right. In the early plays, especially, you just don't see mothers. You see Lady Capulet, but she's primarily basically telling her daughter to get married and do whatever her father says. So she's not. So yeah, I'm trying to think of other mothers. And then, of course, in Pericles, you have the same reunion of mother-daughter at the end of that.
Have you seen this film Ophelia? In
yes.
which we are going to spoil it. We're going to spoil it. So if you're listening to this or watching and you didn't see the movie,
yes,
just make a pause. But well, yes. Ophelia is at the end of the film is a mother, and she's alive.
She's alive, and in fact,
Hamlet's son, I assume.
So Lisa Klein, who wrote that book, Ophelia, and then the film came out based on it. She came and spoke at University of Maine, and so I got to talk to her all about it. And it's a great premise. It's wonderful. I guess all I would say about that is it's interesting that, in order to get, that still the narrative was about her getting pregnant and being a mother.
Yeah.
But it's a great premise because at least she gets to survive.
But the trick used by Juliet, it's okay. It works. It's like, all right.
Exactly right. I forgot that, of course, she's repurposing. Right. And that's one of the things, I guess the last thing I'll say is that one of the things that's been a real pleasure for me with this book is seeing the ways that I feel like Shakespeare's female characters, the ones that come after earlier ones, are able to resuscitate some of those earlier characters that had more tragic deaths. So when I look at the jailer's daughter, for example, in Two Noble Kinsmen, which is one of his latest plays, and he co-authored with Fletcher, she reflects back. You can hear some Desdemona in what she's saying. You can hear some Ophelia in what she's doing, but she doesn't die. So it's like I think it's a way of resuscitating and giving them another life through these later female characters. So there's this kind of cognitive interplay between the female characters, between the plays as well.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Well, it was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
I can't wait to get the book.
Thank you.
Is it hardcover or is it already in paperback?
It is not a paperback yet.
Right.
It is in hardcover, and you can get it electronically. But I hope that people will read it.
It's on Amazon, right?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
And it's through Cambridge University Press.
Okay, that's
good. We'll have access to Cambridge University Press books.
We'll place the link.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been just such a thrill to talk to you. And I didn't get a chance to ask you all about, the productions you've put on that have girls.
Well,
if you're right, because I know you did a Hamlet.
I did Hamlet, and it was called like the feminist Hamlet. So
was it? Was it?
Yeah.
What happened to Ophelia?
No, Ophelia died.